Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Living in the Light. Let's say a prayer together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dearest Swamiji, help us to feel the wisdom behind your words, to live in this world in constant awareness of your presence and the presence of all the masters, that we may know that every thought and action and feeling is inspired and guided by the living God within us. Om. Peace. Amen. Well, dear friends, we are into the last pages of this book, which doesn't mean we're into the last days of it, because I can make so much out of so little, but let's see what happens in any case. My belief is that this is where I am in the book, which is that Swamiji has now laid out his whole understanding of the nature of this path and the importance of it. And so now what he issues is an invitation. Would you like to join this family of self-realization? If so, how can you do so? Well, I mean, it's obvious if you're living in a community, if you're near a center, you have all these different ways of being involved. Although in 1983, when Swamiji wrote this, Ananda was a single location. We had a house. We know that's not fair. We had a house in San Francisco. We had a house in San Francisco. We had a house in Atherton in Palo Alto. We had one in Sacramento. But the real Ananda was still just Ananda Village. And, the internet didn't exist. It was a much different age. So if you would like to join this divine family of self-realization, how can you do so? It was a much more open question. There are several ways, and in any case, your first step should be to do so in your own heart. And this is, again, the theme that Swami has been playing all the way through, that it really counts for nothing to be able to get a membership card and say, this is who I am. If it isn't a direct relationship between you and God, it doesn't really exist. Master said, your religion is not the form you wear outwardly, but the garment of light you weave around your heart. That's just always been such a beautiful way to put it. Master was fond, apparently, of telling this joke about an evangelist named Billy Sunday during Master's time in the 20s and the 30s, the 40s. These evangelical revivals were very common, and there were a number of people who are quite famous, and a man named, with the wonderful name of Billy Sunday, was an evangelist, and he would call people to Christ, and then he would baptize them or bless them and call them saved. So when Billy Sunday, this is the joke, when Billy Sunday died and went to heaven, he got to the gates of the pearly gates, and St. Peter was there, and Peter had the reservation book, and he was turning the pages looking for Billy Sunday's name, to be allowed into heaven. And Peter kept turning the pages and turning the pages. He just couldn't find it. And Billy Sunday was getting more and more irate. He said, "What do you mean my name's not in the book? I've sent thousands and thousands of people to heaven." And Peter looks at him and he says, "Well, sir, you may have sent them, but they never arrived." So, thus, Swami's simple statement, first you have to do it in your heart. And once you've made the alliance in your heart, the outward affirmation of it and the outward benefits of it are extremely real. Extremely real. That's what this whole thing has been about. But only if it's based, only if it grows from a sincere commitment and relationship. So then Swami says, it is possible first to limit your joining to a purely inward commitment. But I've already mentioned that those who seek attunement on their own receive less usually than those who affiliate with others on the path, particularly with those more advanced. I've stressed also the importance of serving the ray, a thing more difficult, though still possible, to do on one's own. So he's simply summarizing all the pages that came before, which is the whole rationale and explanation of why you might want to make an outward affiliation. Why not then stress for everyone the importance of outward affiliation? Swami says, the reason is that people are constituted differently. Much is lost in religion when everyone is pushed and squeezed into the same mold. Much more is lost when people are threatened or dealt with angrily simply because they won't fit the mold. For 2,000 years, Christian churches have threatened dissidents with eternal hellfire. Nowadays, with the spreading belief in reincarnation, people are threatened with incarnations of future suffering. I myself have been told I would be reborn crippled and blind merely because I didn't toe someone else's line. So now we're talking about the negative side of institutions. I mean, the clarity and coherence is a great benefit on the spiritual path when the nature of a particular ray is articulated in such a way that people can really understand with their minds and their hearts what it is they're becoming engaged in. Goodness, Swami wrote 150 books. So he certainly saw the benefit of articulating things. We must make this very clear. It's not lack of clarity is not more spiritual than bringing things to a clear understanding. I know I've met resistance sometimes from people against bringing things to a clear focus. I will have to say I've rarely seen that work to people's benefit. Often the lack of desire to bring things to a clear focus is either because there's internal contradictions that people don't want to face, or internal failures that people don't want to face. But I have seen without a clear concept, sometimes we make decisions that seem like good decisions, but we don't realize that we're contradicting our basic premises. So it's not lack of clarity that Swamiji is speaking against. Why not just keep this inward? It's not in order to keep it vague. To keep it clear is very positive. But what Swami objects to is that, as he said, obviously, much harm is done when everybody is asked to fit a single mold. One of the wonderful things about Ananda, even still, I don't even want to say even still, one of the wonderful things about Ananda is the enormous tolerance for eccentricity. And Swamiji himself says that the more you get in touch with your own divine point of origin, the more original you become and the less you are a copy of anyone or anything or anyone else. Your own natural inclinations, your own natural personality can come out. Swamiji himself had a tremendous capacity to absorb and harmonize very, very different energies. It was a unique power that he had, you might say, to be able to hold a lot of disparate energies together. You have to have a lot of spiritual energy to do it. Master was also able to do it. And as the end of Master's life was approaching, Master himself sort of, house cleaning would be too strong a word, but he recognized that at least in the core of his work, there needed to be a little more unity of purpose, that without his presence, there couldn't be quite as many different points of view. There was no one who could reconcile it in the way that Master could. But nonetheless, the nature of self-realization is that we do have to find our own way. I particularly liked those early years because there was very little of what you might call corporate culture. At least that's how it felt to me. There was no fixed expectation of what you were supposed to be. Now, merely because we have a regular Sunday service that has a particular pattern to it. We have a blessing ceremony, purification ceremony. There's an inclination to see what others are doing and then mold your behavior after that. That can be completely sincere. It's not like the mere fact that all of Krishna's soldiers look like Krishna does not mean that anybody is behaving inappropriately. But what Swami says, when the institution says, these are the characteristics of someone who's part of our group and you must meet all these characteristics, then he goes a step further. Even worse, he said, is when you threaten people if they don't. And the Catholic Church especially, well, actually all the Christian churches, because of their interpretation as Jesus being the only Son of God and I am the way, the truth, and the light, and personalizing that to the incarnation of Jesus instead of understanding it as it was meant, which is the universal Christ consciousness, which is what Jesus meant. Then if you don't follow him, you're damned. I mean, that's pretty scary. And when the church was empowered, to be excommunicated by the church was an extraordinary threat to your eternal salvation. And even very, very independent thinkers, when threatened with excommunication, it was not something they could take lightly. You have to understand each era on its own terms. Nowadays, the idea of one institution excommunicating me, it just doesn't have any weight. It's like, why would I care? But during the time when the Catholic Church especially was supreme, and the alternative, well, when the church damned you, you were damned. And that was a frightening prospect. You were damned for all eternity. And it's easy to see why institutions start going there, because you're trying to keep everybody in line. You're trying to not have people be led astray by wrong thinking. See, heresy is really scary for the church, especially if they believe it. I mean, there's two sides of it. One is deeply sincerely held belief, and the absolute heartbreak of thinking that somebody is not going to be saved, and that's sincere if that's a sincere belief. The other side is the institutional desire to keep control, and unfortunately sometimes they get kind of mixed up with each other. And when you have somebody within your organization who begins to speak a line of teaching which is not consistent with what the institution says is true, and especially if the one propounding that line of teaching has magnetism, and they have the capacity to draw people into their way of thinking, then all of a sudden you're looking at your church, which is supposed to be going forward in this certain way, and in the center of it, you have people saying, no, but that's not true. That's not what Jesus meant. That's not really how it goes. It's very disconcerting. It's disconcerting because people are going to be protesting. You can't keep the flock in line. And as I was saying more sincerely, it may be disconcerting because you may think they're going to hell if they follow the heretic's line. So what do? You get rid of the heretic. I mean, that would be the obvious and natural thing that you would have to do. And you would either forcibly eject him or imprison him, as people used to do in modern times. You take them to court and you try to bankrupt them. That's sort of what happened to us for a while when Swamiji's Gurubhais considered his heretical influence, because he had so much magnetism and he was presenting a contrary point of view as to what Master's teachings were, and they just wanted to eliminate him because he was messing up the game by just pulling people out of what they thought was the true teaching. But we joked because in Kali Yuga we would have been imprisoned, and in this rising Dwapara, at least we were just taken to court, and we had to spend literally $13 million by the time it was all done, $1 million a year of money that I don't know where it came from. We sort of manifested it out of thin air. We just kept opening our wallets, and every time you opened it, there was another $20 in it. So you put it into the pot until we raised 11 of the 13 million during the years we were doing it. But we could always go home We weren't in prison. We could go out to lunch, we could go home, we could sleep in our own beds. It was great. We were threatened with eternal damnation, but that didn't, well, in this case, we're threatened with many lifetimes of suffering. But we didn't believe it, so it didn't matter. Jokingly, and I do say this jokingly, at times, in trying to move a community forward, and there's lots of different points of view because Swamiji has trained us to all have lots of different points of view. That's the best of Ananda, is that you're allowed to speak your mind. In fact, you're expected to speak your mind. You're expected to stand up for what you personally believe, even if it's not always consistent. Of course, now here we get into attunement with those who are more advanced on the path, and I've discussed that a lot, so I'm not going to go back there. But sometimes I think longingly how nice it would be to threaten people with just eternal damnation, because then you wouldn't have to just keep talking about these subjects. Now, of course, I don't really mean that, but I do mean that, which is I recognize the temptation. I recognize the marvelous convenience of it. That if you have in your arsenal something called eternal damnation, that keeps the boys and the girls in the straight line. It's really nice. And again, if you believe it, it's better. I have to say, this is very interesting to me. There's a writer, her name is Pearl S. Buck. Now, some of you may know her, but this is where age and the ephemeral nature of fame sort of come together. Pearl S. Buck was a magnificently well-known best-selling author, sold I don't know, thousands and millions of copies of many, many books that she wrote. She was a wonderful writer. And her father was a missionary, a dedicated missionary. And he took the family to China. And so she grew up in China. And he was very well regarded and a bit unusual in the missionary field, because whereas most, I believe they were English, not American. No, they were American. Most Westerners, white Westerners, who went to China lived in enclaves of their own people, and they sort of lived in a gated community almost of their own world, and so they essentially lived within this country in their own world. They would make forays out to meet the people and to try to do their work. But her father scorned that kind of separation, and he just took his family right into the Chinese culture. And so she grew up in a Chinese world, speaking Chinese, being involved with the people, and many, many of her books are about China. They're very interesting. The Good Earth is her most famous book. But she also wrote a biography of her family. She wrote a biography of her father and her mother, both. I don't know the names of the books now, but they're well worth reading. The one about her father especially. Now, her father was highly regarded. He started many churches. He learned the local languages. He translated, I believe, even the Bible, but I'm not certain of that. But he did a lot of translations into the local language. And what was so, and here's the point, he absolutely believed what he was doing. And he believed it so deeply, he really lived it. He was an odd character. He had a very sort of a harsh streak in him to a certain extent. But he loved Jesus, and he was doing what he was doing because he believed that people could have eternal salvation if they came to Jesus. And as a consequence, he was utterly selfless. He just had no concern about himself in his tremendous desire to save souls. Now, where his harshness came in is the way he related to his family and to his wife and various things. He was not balanced, but he was an admirable character, and the power of that belief that it was either salvation or eternal damnation really made him into a great man. So when it's sincere, that's completely different than when it's a method of keeping the institution going. But even then, you see, and this is going back to where we've been in this brochure, when what is best for the institution is really best for everyone. And I was talking then about some of the scandals in the Catholic Church and so on like that. It's all very nuanced, and the reason for having it all clear in our mind is because these are archetypal temptations, and when we start moving through our own spiritual life, it's quite surprising the kinds of things that will arise within you and seem like a good idea. When I was watching some of the ways that some of the early disciples of Master, who ended up being in charge of his organization after he died, some of the exceedingly uncharitable ways that they behaved. And I, on more than one occasion, communicated directly with those directors because I felt that I had something to say. But in one particular letter, which is something that I realized, this extremely sweet young woman had become a very judgmental, very harsh old woman. And I wrote to her and I said, I'm sure you didn't shift. And there was a particular incident in which I was personally involved. That's what caused me to write. I didn't just sort of randomly write critical letters, but I was involved, oddly. I was personally involved with someone that she was close to. Her response to the person that we both knew really seemed inappropriate to me. And I felt I needed to speak up because I didn't know who else would. And I'm happy to say, of course, she never acknowledged it, but it was the only letter I ever wrote that seemed to get actually a result. But I wrote and I said, I'm sure you didn't become like this overnight. I said, I'm sure it was thousands and thousands of small decisions. And each one just moved you a little farther away from your natural sweetness into, well, for the good of Master's work, this is what I have to do. Inch by inch. I always had a lot of sympathy for those directors, even when we were at war with them in the courts, and I really did not condone their behavior because I understand how it happens. That's why I joke, but I joke about it because it really happens. You know, somebody is not going along with your program, and you would like them to go along with your program. And you have to keep working with them because they're your people and you can't just turn your back on them. And maybe they're right even, so you have to keep working with them. But it's tempting. It's tempting to try to get some kind of institutional clout. And you do that a quarter inch at a time. One small decision, one small decision. That's among reasons why Swamiji said to us, as us meaning in this case it was those of us who were in charge of communities earlier in the development of the Ananda communities, when we suddenly found ourselves being in positions of leadership that we were having to grow into. It was not like we already knew how to do this. And he said to us, and I've repeated this probably in recent context here, but it's still worth saying. He said, it's presumptuous not to take your own self, your own spiritual development into account. And that was when he said, for example, if a stern decision is required in a certain circumstance, which sometimes it is, sometimes you have to say to someone, really, we really can't. We can't have this. We have to find another way to handle this. Sometimes you have to draw a line. If a stern decision is required in the situation, but being stern is not good for you, he said, don't make that decision. Make a soft, charitable decision instead. Where there is dharma, there will be victory. Because it's presumptuous to think that I won't be affected if I go against what's best for me. And I've consistently found that to be true. There have been circumstances in this community where the Ananda tradition was a certain, I'm going to use the word penance. A certain restraint was required, should have been required of someone. But I just didn't feel that I could, in all sincerity, say, this is how this should be handled. So I didn't. And people would say to me, but isn't it supposed to be? I said, yeah, but I'm not going to do it. And I think in every case it was fine, and there's no question that it was fine for me, because I can't go down that slippery slope. It's too dangerous. So we can't just dismiss these things as, oh, that's not about me. I would never say such a thing. But be conscious, be careful. And it's very amusing, just to shift it from eternal damnation to many lifetimes, many future lifetimes of suffering. Swami talked about some Buddhist temple he saw it was actually written in their brochure that anyone who spits on the temple grounds will be reincarnated as a teetery bird or something like that. Swami said to one of the natives, what kind of bird is this? Oh, it's a despicable, sort of garbage-eating bird. Now, whether somebody wrote that tongue-in-cheek or whether they really meant it, who knows? But who are we to say? It's between you and God. But trust me, the temptation is there. So I'm going to just read a last so Swami says, rather than threatening you with terrible future incarnations. Swami says, I would offer you this advice then. Go where you find inspiration. If you follow this simple guideline and continue to follow it, whenever the directions change, your attunement will continue to deepen. Ignore, therefore, the negative reasons why you should not affiliate with others. But there are still, as I've pointed out already, positive reasons why you should do so if you feel so inspired. Now, Swami is answering without being explicit, something extremely direct, which is and was true, and I don't know if it is still. Swamiji was considered by Master's first organization to be a heretic in the most classic sense of the word, to the extent that, quote, Kriya initiation from Ananda doesn't work, that it doesn't have the blessings of the Masters. If you're initiated in Kriya through Ananda and not through Master's original organization, you really are not truly practicing Kriya, because the blessings of the Masters are limited to those who are authorized by that organization. I mean, it may sound crazy, but that's exactly what was said, and may still be said for all I know, but I pray that all the hatchet's been buried and it's not being said. But should I go to Ananda? No, you don't want to go to Ananda. It's not really Master's organization, it's just Kriyananda's. And Kriyananda is not a true disciple. Now this is 1983, and that was the party line. So there I am, I read Autobiography of a Yogi, the man on the street. I read Autobiography of a Yogi. In 1983, there was only one edition of that book, and it was published by the original organization. So if you wanted to be involved with Master, that's where you went. And then if you happened to find out about Ananda and went to Ananda also, but went back and asked them, what should I do? They would simply say, no, don't go to Ananda, not if you really want to be in tune with Master. So we're not talking about the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. We were talking about 1983. So Swami says, here's what I say to you. Ignore it. Go where you feel inspired. So Swami's putting and continue to follow your inspiration. So he didn't want it to be, oh, I sign up here and that's it, I'm done. Now I'm eternally saved and I never have to deal with it. Swami continually puts it back on the devotee that this is you and your own experience. And no one can walk the path for you. You have to walk it on the strength of your own heart. And that's the wonderful news about the whole path. We get to walk it on the strength of our own hearts. God bless you, my friends.